And Joanne for hosting us today. Good morning everyone, I'm Vicky Browning. I'm the Interim Chief Exec here at WIG. Welcome to everybody in the room and welcome to all of you joining us online. We're going to hear in a moment from John Craven from the Social Mobility Commission about how as organisations we can increase the shift of the dial to reduce social inequality without increasing the gap between the top and the bottom of the socio-economic ladder. Just a quick note, John's opening remarks are going to be recorded and they will be available afterwards, but we're going to hold the Q&A under Chatham House so that everybody has a chance to speak freely and John can answer freely. So please do not report the Q&A more widely than this event. For those of you online, we will be taking questions. Please leave your name and your organisation in the chat with your question. I can't ask questions if I don't know who you are, so please do let us know who you are. So, to introduce our speaker today, John was appointed head of the Social Mobility Commission in June 2020. The Commission's mission is to create a society where the circumstances of birth do not determine outcomes in life. Before joining the Commission, John was Chief Exec of the social mobility charity Upreach for 6.5 years, having previously worked in investment banking and as a teacher. So a really interesting career spanning different sectors, and that obviously is at the heart of what WIG does. So it'd be really interesting for us to hear about how across the sectors we can make some changes in this issue. So John, really glad that you've joined us. Please do come and say a few words.
Thank you very much and good morning everybody. I should perhaps just clarify, I joined the Social Mobility Commission in June 2022 and I say that because it's been a very, very interesting time to join the Cabinet Office. I basically joined a few weeks before Boris Johnson resigned and we then obviously had a very interesting period of time in government and to be a fly on the wall during that time, having never worked in government, has certainly been interesting for me. I won't dwell on that. What I wanted to do this morning was to tell you a bit about the Social Mobility Commission and a bit about where we see social mobility, or the state of social mobility at the moment. We launched what we call a new or a fresh approach to social mobility, and I want to tell you a bit about that. And then I want to talk a lot about the current situation and about what employers can do to help make a difference. When I was at Upreach, we worked really closely with lots of employers. I really saw the value that employers can add in this space. So I really want to sort of emphasise the Commission's views about how you really can add value and the kinds of things that you should be focusing on. So let's see if the clicker works. Great. So we've had an interesting time. We're in effectively the third iteration of the Commission. So it was first set up as the Social Mobility and Child Poverty Commission. In 2015, that was then changed to be just the Social Mobility Commission, so the words child poverty were dropped. I think it was 2017 when all the commissioners resigned en masse because they weren't happy about what the government was doing and the amount of commitment the government had to the issue. A new set of commissioners were appointed under Dame Martina Milburn's leadership. That was in 2018, and they had a 3-year term which ended in October 2021. At that point, a new chair and deputy chair, Catherine Birbalsingh and Alan Francis, were appointed, and there was a process to appoint new commissioners which took a bit longer with everything happening politically than it might have done, but they were appointed in September of last year. Catherine subsequently resigned a couple of weeks ago. I think Catherine is very respected in the education world and is doing some amazing work at Michaela. She can be a bit of a divisive figure on social media, which she acknowledges, and I think she felt there was a bit of a conflict between what she could say at events or when representing the Commission and what she maybe wanted to say given her views on education and parenting and other things. So she left because I think she didn't see the roles as being very compatible. So we now have Alan Francis as our interim chair. It very much is continuity. Alan was sort of very much the strategic thinker, and Catherine was her and Alan were very aligned in terms of their views, but it was very much Alan setting the strategy for the Commission. So we appointed, as I say, 6 commissioners back in September, and we are now very much looking forward to Alan leading our work going forward. We've got a business plan which we published in September, setting out what we're going to do over the next year or so, and we're about to publish a strategy document. We also have a State of the Nation report, which is something that we publish every year that is designed to sort of show the state of social mobility across the UK at a given point in time. And our next version of that is out in June. So what do we mean by this fresh approach? Effectively, what Catherine and Alan wanted to do was to focus a bit more on smaller steps for a start. So often when we think of social mobility, we think of what some might call rags to riches stories of someone from a very disadvantaged background making it into an elite university and onto an elite profession. And that's great, and we all should celebrate that. But what's also important is a far greater number of people making smaller steps to progress. And that might be if, for example, both of their parents are unemployed or they're from a very disadvantaged background, but they manage to make steps into full-time employment themselves, or holding down a career, or making it into other careers that maybe aren't elite. And it's not all about university. University is important, and it's a great social mobility enabler, but university in itself isn't social mobility. It doesn't necessarily mean you're going to go on to good jobs afterwards. And equally, there are lots of other routes that are very important into work that don't involve university. And those should be celebrated and showcased as well. So that's one angle of their fresh approach. I think they were also interested in what individuals can do, so very interested in agency, in what schools can do and what works in schools, in what employers can do and what other stakeholders can do, and a belief that it's not all about what government need to do. Now, of course, government play a part, and we do work closely with government. I had meetings with ministers yesterday talking about what we think they should do and the progress we're making on some of those areas. But it's all about what other stakeholders can do, and that's really what we want to focus on going forward. So we have this programme of work, and at the moment we're focused on these 3 key areas. So first of all, education. We're looking at things like early years all the way through to FE and universities. We're also looking at evaluating family-based initiatives and what works with parenting. So, for example, looking at Sure Start, which was around many years ago, and the family hubs that are more common now, and looking at how effective they are and what difference they make. And I think, for those of you who know the sector quite well, early years is so important. That period between 0 and 2 and indeed 0 and 5 before children go to school is so formative. And having a great focus there, if you're interested in social mobility, is really, really key. Of course, schools are important too, particularly those first 2 key stages, but in fact all the key stages. But you can't neglect early years if you want to make a difference. So we're also looking at employment, and we've got a big programme. We do employer masterclasses every month. I think we had 300 plus sign-ups to our last one last week on data. We have recently set up an employer advisory group, which I'll talk about very shortly, and we did an employer consultation, which I'll mention later on, which we're going to publish our first report later this probably next month, actually. So we do a lot of work with employers. We've got toolkits online, which set out the kind of steps that you can take, and I'll talk a bit about those again later on. But we're also interested in not just what the big professional organisations can do. And I think what I saw at Upreach is that looking at all employers generally, some are very well progressed in their journey in terms of understanding what social mobility is and what they can do to make a difference. And there are others who are really just looking at it for the first time and realising that they might have a part to play. And what we want to do at the Commission is to try and support all of those organisations and to help share best practice and help to convene and to really get a good understanding of what works and help using our convening power to try to spread that more widely. And that includes actually to smaller businesses who maybe don't have the same level of resources as some of the bigger employers to make a difference, but still can do a lot. Finally, enterprise and the economy. So the reason that we find that is important is that when an economy is growing, when it's dynamic, creating new opportunities in new areas, we think there are links to that supporting social mobility. So when more opportunities are being created or they're in different areas, that is actually a good enabler for those from less advantaged backgrounds who don't have the networks or the links in the established areas to progress. And that's the focus of our research going forward as well. So obviously the economy has not done so well in the last few years, and indeed the last decade if you look at your living standards overall. And that may be a cause for why social mobility hasn't progressed as much as we would like in terms of employment. So I mentioned our State of the Nation report. This comes out every June. The next one I think is going to be really interesting. So last year we launched a new social mobility index, which tries to look at, I guess, three different things. First of all, what are the long-term mobility outcomes? And by that, what we mean is if we look at people in, say, their 50s, when they're well progressed into their careers, how have they done compared to their parents, or given where they've come from? Yeah, how does that relate to their parental income or their parental occupation? And actually, before we did this, there wasn't much work connecting those two things, i.e. looking at actual people and how they had progressed up to the point of being in their 50s. When we thought about social mobility, we were often talking about much earlier steps, so getting into university or people getting into certain levels of jobs in their 20s. So these longer term outcomes we think are really important to focus on. I have a caveat, which is that they're lagging by nature. So if we just look at them, they reflect the situation 20, 30 years ago. So it's important we don't just focus on that. Secondly, we look at intermediate outcomes. So we're looking at those first steps into the labour market, for example. So there we are looking at what happens perhaps in later education stages and also at maybe in their 20s, because that's a good indicator of where they'll end up many years later. And then finally, we look at the drivers. So what are the things that enable social mobility? So there we're thinking about education. We're thinking about early years. We're talking about the enabling factors that help people to progress. So the index looks at all of those things, and there's a huge amount of data. It's quite a long report. What we're doing this year is two big things which I think are really important. First of all, we're looking at what many people would call intersectional analysis. We're not calling it that, but what we're looking at is how socioeconomic background interacts with gender, ethnicity, disability, first of all. So we'll be publishing in this index, for example, gender breakdowns and regional breakdowns, looking at how all these things compare in different parts of the country. And that's really, really important because, as I'll show later, London is actually a success story in many, many ways compared to the rest of the country, in terms of educational outcomes for those from disadvantaged backgrounds and in terms of social mobility more generally. And there are lots of reasons for that which we can go into, but it's important to say that outside of London that there are more tricky challenges. And if you've got the data to support that, we can do something about it. The second thing we're doing is we are publishing, or rather producing a website. So you can go online, a bit like the COVID maps a few years ago, where you can look at what the data is for a particular factor, driver, intermediate outcome, or in a particular area. So you might put in your postcode and it would show you, okay, so Nottinghamshire, where I'm from, okay, it's good for this, it's bad for that. Where is it doing well? Where do the challenges remain? So I think that will be really, really useful for a lot of stakeholders in thinking how they can make a difference. And putting it into a more interactive, accessible form, i.e. a website, should hopefully make it more used than having a long report, which is often harder to read. And I guess the other thing about the fresh approach that we wanted to highlight was that while the narrative around social mobility can often be quite negative, if you look at the medium term, the picture isn't as bad as is sometimes portrayed. And I want to try and give a fair and realistic sort of portrayal of where we see the data at the moment. So first of all, looking at occupational mobility, I'm afraid a lot of the data is for men. and that's just because of what was collected over the years. Actually, when you look at a lot of the data education-wise and otherwise, women are tending to do much better. And if you look at, for example, the benefits of going to university, for women that go to university, the extra value they get in terms of labour market value is much higher in most cases for most subjects. But anyway, so a lot of the data that exists is for men. And if you look at that occupational mobility, and that middle line on the left is the upward mobility that people from different birth cohorts have experienced. It's actually been quite stable over time. So this is looking at how much people have kind of progressed up. You could say perhaps it's fallen a slight bit for those born in the 70s. At the same time, those experiencing downward mobility has also gone up a bit, which sort of suggests that the opportunities at the top have maybe declined slightly. The chart on the right shows the proportion increase that experience increased sort of long-range social mobility, so how many people are progressing up the ladder. And again, you can see that on that measure, more people who are working today have experienced upward mobility in their lives. So I think that's important to show, but they are very long-term measures, and it doesn't really tell you much about what's happening right now. Also, if you look at income mobility, because there are lots of different ways you can measure social mobility. You can look at occupational background, you can look at income, you can look at wealth, all sorts of different things. There is some evidence that it's declined in the last sort of few years. For people born in the 70s, for example, that income mobility has declined, and many people think it may be declining further. So just to say, the picture on a historical basis isn't a clear sort of portrayal that things are getting worse and worse and worse. Things have actually stayed around the same and maybe have got a little bit worse in some areas. Now, of course, then we had the pandemic. And we were hesitant when we put the last report out because there wasn't much data there to show how attainment itself had been affected. We had all the CAGs and the tags or whatever they were, all the different calculated grades at A-level and GCSE. And it was very hard to, because they weren't independently assessed, to know what the trends were. Now we have a lot more data and a lot more research has been done, and the picture is not great. Pre-pandemic, on lots of measures, and a huge amount of progress had been made, not a huge amount actually, some good progress had been made closing the attainment gap since 2010. And that's true if you look at GCSEs, if you look at A-levels, for example, and at Key Stage 1 and 2 as well. Now, unfortunately, on some measures, all of that progress is now reversed. And on others, it's gone down a long way. And the fact that that's happened at Key Stage 1 and 2, as I'll show in a second, is not a good indicator of how things might progress in future years, because the best indicator of how you do it, GCSE, is sort of what you end up getting at Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2. So we not only have big gaps now, but we've got even bigger gaps coming through the system that we need to close. So this is some research that the Cosmo group did. So this was some research led by UCL and the Sutton Trust, a really, really big study. And it's a really interesting report. There are early findings. I show a couple of them here just to show that people from working class backgrounds are more likely to feel that they'd fallen behind, and indeed were less likely to get more online lessons in the third lockdown. First lockdown was quite similar actually, and I think schools were quite slow overall to react, but when they did, students from working class backgrounds tended to have less access. Now, if you look at the attainment gap, this shows Key Stage 1 data. There's been a big fall overall, not just looking at disadvantaged students, but a big fall in those meeting the expected standards at Key Stage 1 and 2. So first of all, there's a big challenge around attainment that schools need to tackle. People are not as progressed as they should be or as they were a few years ago. And not only that, but from a social mobility perspective, those from disadvantaged backgrounds have fallen further behind. That attainment gap has widened. If you look at Key Stage 2, the same is true. And they have this measure called the Disadvantaged Gap Index, which don't worry too much about what it means, but it's basically trying to show the difference between those from disadvantaged backgrounds and the rest. And if that number was 0, it would mean there's no difference. The higher the number is, the bigger the difference. And effectively what we've seen between 2019 and 2022 is a big widening in that gap, such that we've gone all the way back to where we were in 2012. So all the progress that schools have made has been reversed. If we look at Key Stage 4, so GCSE results, the same is true. The scale makes it hard to see, but this disadvantage attainment gap, we've reversed all the progress that was made in 10 years. So really, I just want to say that education-wise, there's a huge amount of work that needs to be done in schools, and to the extent that employers can play a part, one way or another, by supporting schools and colleges, fantastic. It's needed. I also wanted to shine a light on the danger of focusing on a binary measure. So often people look at, say, they might divide socioeconomic background into 3 groups: working class, intermediate, and professional, for example. Or you might look at a group like those who are once eligible for free school meals and the rest. And what we find actually is that if you do that, you're missing out some really important detail. So if you look at free school meals, for example, if you look at the group that have been eligible for free school meals for 80% of their time at school, so they're persistently disadvantaged, they do far, far, far worse than the group who are maybe eligible for a term or a year or 2. And the same is true if you look at working class students. If you separate that into sort of skilled working class and routine working class, and that would include those who've been unemployed as well, it's that second group for whom the outcomes are far, far worse. And actually the skilled working class tend to have very similar outcomes to those from intermediate professions. And equally, if you look at those from professional backgrounds, there's some evidence as well that suggests that it is a smaller group at the very top who really benefit from the networks and the all the other things, might be the private schools, whatever it is. So you kind of have this group at the very top and a group at the very bottom, and the difference between those is enormous. And if you just focus on 2 bigger groups, you don't quite see that as much. What does it mean for you? I think 2 things. First of all, focus on trying to support the group at the bottom. They really, really need it. But also that big group in the middle, don't ignore them, because the danger is that they get overlooked because we think that group at the top are representative of everyone. So when we think about the advantages of networks, for example, work experience and everything else, it might be that there's this group at the top who are getting all of those things. I also want to focus on ethnicity for a second. So this is some DFE data that was published last year. And it focuses on those students eligible for free school meals who go on to university. There's also a chart I could have shown which focuses on those going to higher tariff universities, which would have shown the same thing. And what is really interesting here is the underperformance of, first of all, those from Gypsy Roma or travellers of Irish heritage backgrounds, but also white British and white and black Caribbean mixed heritage. If you look at white British boys who are eligible for free school meals, so from poorer backgrounds, only 14% of those go to university. Yet if you look at any other ethnic group, a far greater proportion are going to university. So Indian boys, 46%, Chinese boys, 65%, Black African, 53%. And females overall, regardless of ethnicity, I think that's true. Yeah, regardless of ethnicity, a greater proportion of females go to university than males. So, we often overlook this. And it's actually interesting if you look at those not eligible for free school meals, that again, white British boys, and indeed white British girls, overall underperform. Now, there are lots of reasons behind this, and trying to get under the reasons for that is part of what we're trying to do. Is it something around cultural expectations? Is it something about family support? There's certainly all kinds of different things that could be explaining this. But when you have such a stark difference between that 14% number for white British poor boys and any other number you can name on there, we really need to get to the heart of that, because that is a big challenge. You can also look at progression rates across the country. And if you look at regions, someone who's eligible for free school meals in London is more likely to go to university than someone not eligible for free school meals in any other region of the UK. So something good is happening in London. Ethnicity explains a huge amount of it, but there are maybe other things like the proximity to employers and the support that they can give. It might be something down to education and the funding it got, but we think ethnicity explains a huge amount. I won't go into that just in the interest of time, but happy to answer the questions. So moving on to employers and what we do with employers and where we think you can help. I hope that showing the challenges that we have, particularly with education, and how that will manifest itself in worse social mobility in the years to come if we don't do something about it. I hope that is seen as a call to action. We really need employers to do much, much more. And it's not just education, it's about access to things like work experience, to mentorship, to career advice. When I was teaching, I taught in both the state sector at schools that were in special measures and indeed outstanding schools doing great things in deprived areas. But I also taught at a private school where 1 in 3 people went to Oxbridge. And I was amazed by the career support that people got there. So people were every week having opportunities. Actually, I remember one, there was the head of an architect practice and someone who led the architecture course at a university. And they were both parents of children at the school. And they were there offering support to anyone in the school who wanted to find out more about architecture. And they had different sessions like that every week. And everyone left the school having done work experience in a professional setting. And everyone left the school knowing about different options and knowing about the graduate recruitment game that they needed to do. I also remember one student asking me, look, I don't think I'm going to get the grades to get into the university I want to go to, so I'm looking at a degree apprenticeship or possibly a school leaver program. And there wasn't a stigma associated with it. And the danger is that actually, and if some of the data supports this, that a lot of, when we talk about apprenticeships, there's this association that we think that must be for students from less advantaged backgrounds. But very often, actually, if they're very good and well-respected apprenticeships, they get taken by those from more advantaged backgrounds. So do look at the data, and I'll come back to that in a second. Do look at the data for those who are applying and getting into your apprenticeships. They may well be dominated by those from more advantaged backgrounds. So the sorts of things that we recommend employers do, and these are the 5 things in our toolkit, are focused around vision, talent, culture, progression, and data. Now, data is absolutely key. If we didn't have data on gender, for example, in terms of representation and the gender pay gap, how would we have known how big the problem was, and how would we have had the momentum and the passion to do something about it? And progress, has been made there. There's obviously a lot more to do in many areas, but without data, we wouldn't have got anywhere near to making the progress that's happened so far. And the same is true about social mobility. If you don't measure data, how do you know the extent of the problem? So measuring data is important, and there's some good examples on our website about how you can do that. I'll maybe skip the other 4 things, but do take a look on our website for more details. I want to just quickly talk about the advisory group that we set up. So we've got representatives from about, I think, 11 or 12 different companies across different sectors from all over the UK. And what we want to do is to really understand what they find is working, and importantly, what evidence they have for the interventions that they're doing being successful. Because sometimes what happens is we all want to do something, and we don't base what we do on evidence. We think, oh, this sounds like it would be good. It's what another organisation is doing. We're going to do some work experience, or we're going to do this in our local school, or we're going to do that. And we want to move that to something which is much more evidence informed. So by really trying to help employers to measure the impact more rigorously, so that we can then help them to share the best practice, so that people can be effectively having more impact. Now, when we did this consultation at the end of last year, we were really interested in the responses, and that was one theme that came through. Employers are doing a huge amount, but when it comes to measuring the impact, it's a bit harder to do, and that's where we think we can provide some support. We're going to be releasing the consultation in a few weeks' time, And there's 5 different areas that it will focus on. So first of all, leadership. You're having leadership from the top, having vocal stakeholders talking about the importance of social mobility and the importance of diversity within the organisation in terms of socioeconomic background is important. And not just talking about it, but resourcing it properly. The number of employers I've spoken to who've said, we would love to do X, Y, Z. We just don't have the resources to do it. So it's important to not just talk about it, but to put money behind it. Secondly, data. So over a third of the employers listed data as their key challenge. It's not as simple as collecting data on socioeconomic background as it might be on gender, for example, or even ethnicity. So we have some guidance on our website about how you can do that. And there are some firms like PwC and KPMG and some others in the legal sector who've really led the way on that. And it's not something you can just do overnight. It can take a bit of time to think it through and to get that data there. Thirdly, outreach. I'm not sure I like the word outreach because it almost seems like it's almost condescending in a way. And we still use it, but I'm careful in how we talk about it. So I guess what we mean though is trying to reach out to those across the country, not just in the local communities, although that's important, but trying to reach out to those who maybe aren't considering your firm or your sector because they don't know about it, or because of myths, or because they don't have the networks or whatever to think about it. So I would really encourage you to do what you can to reach out in your communities, support the schools in your communities and beyond. And I guess one thing I found as well is that the schools that are hardest to reach, the schools that are less likely to return the calls because they're so busy and stretched, are the ones that really need your support. The ones that you have a group set up to do it are probably already doing great things. So don't be discouraged if you're not getting good relationship management from a school. It's probably an indication that they need you even more. Apprenticeships. So apprenticeships are, we all know they can be fantastic, and trying to make sure that a lot of that is directed at the people that really need that support is important too. So obviously when we think of apprenticeships, it could be apprenticeships for existing staff, it could be even level 7 qualifications, but also making sure that there are apprenticeships for at the entry level, and that those are supporting disadvantaged students. And finally, hiring. There's lots of different things you can do on hiring, from contextualized recruitment to blind CVs, so where you're not looking at, for example, educational institutions. There are some firms who are dropping academic requirements. I think there's no single answer that fits everybody, but what I would say is think about your definition of talent. What is it that you really need in the jobs that you're recruiting for? In some cases, if you're hiring people that need to sit accountancy exams, or maybe lawyer exams as well, you might need actually people who are very good at passing exams, absorbing a lot of information. So academic requirements might be important, or more important than otherwise. But there are lots of other roles where actually you might be more interested in other skills. And academic requirements can sometimes just be a filter, so that it's just one way of reducing the number of applications to review. So really try and think hard about what it is you need in that role, and trying to assess for it rather than using blind filters that maybe aren't the most effective. I think Zoom and Teams and things is brilliant, because if you can do online interviewing, it removes that barrier for people having to travel and pay for interview costs. So that can be very good. Really think through things like work experience as well. It can often be a proxy for privilege if they secured it through networks. And not having work experience can often be not because people aren't proactive or didn't try, it's just not having that opportunity. So think about the value of actual paid work in a non-professional setting, and the skills that can develop too. I said finally, progression is actually the final one. There's so much you can do to promote that diverse and inclusive culture, and all the kinds of things that you would do for things like gender and ethnicity. A lot of the themes are true here as well. So having employee networks can be very valuable. Having very clear pathways for progression, for promotion, and for pay so that it's not it's not about who you know, to understand those. So when I was at Upreach, we surveyed all of our alumni who had gone on to these different jobs, and they wrote a report, I think was out last year, where alumni told us what they thought employers were doing well and what they could do differently. So I'd recommend taking a look at that too. I mentioned some things you can do, and I'm just going to very quickly finish off. Data, collecting and analysing data, thinking about a benchmark that you should be aiming for is important. Engaging and supporting your communities, so suppliers, clients, schools, colleges. Widening your search, helping to deepen the talent pool, so helping to sort of train and develop talent, not just hiring. So by that I mean, what can you do in schools, colleges, universities to help people to develop the skills that you're looking for when you hire? And then sharing best practice. I mentioned KPMG and PwC as two employers that have done a lot. And just the final slide, just to finish off. When you're doing this work, think about whether you want to engage third-party providers. Think about, are their motives aligned to yours? Are they charities? Are they businesses with a profit motive? Look out for cherry picking. So it can be easy to signpost that very high performing student almost as a recruitment agent. It's much harder to sort of develop the talent and try and deepen that talent pool. So really think through what you're trying to do there. I've noticed a lot more cynicism, both within employees, within firms, and more generally about PR activities. So we used to get contacted by PR firms at Upreach where their client basically wanted an article in a paper saying what great things they're doing around social mobility. We refused to talk to them in the end because it's not about getting the PR, it's about making a difference. And I'd really encourage you not to just do things like signing pledges or paying money to be featured in magazines with politicians. That I don't think is actually making a difference. Focus on actually having impact, and you'll engage your employees in a far better way. Think about males from white working class backgrounds. Not a popular diversity initiative, but the data speaks for itself. So what are your CSR teams doing? What's your recruitment team? What's your D&I strategist doing to support those groups? And think about the challenge outside London. We have some more data on our website, but we'll stop there. And apologies if I've overran very slightly. Thank you.